Lois, you may proceed with the program.
Thanks, Lionel, and hi, everyone. Welcome to our program on the legal implications of quantum computing, brought to you by the ABA Science and Technology Law section. I'm the secretary of the section this year. I will be moderating today's program, and we have two distinguished speakers. Kanaya Konkoli Tege is the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Government Relations for Continuum. Previously, she was the General Counsel for Honeywell Quantum Solutions and Honeywell Federal Marketing, and an attorney with the U.S. Department of the Interior and the U.S. Department of Energy. Kanaya serves as the Vice Chair of the section's Big Data Committee. And Mark Jackson is the quantum evangelist at Continuum. As a physicist and mathematician, he spent 10 years researching superstring theory and cosmology, co-authoring almost 40 technical articles. To promote the public understanding of science, he founded the science crowdfunding platform, Fiat Physica, and nonprofit Science Partnership Fund. He's adjunct faculty at Singularity University and a director of Astronomers Without Borders. And I'll be moderating today's program. I am, as I said, I'm secretary of the SciTech section this year, and mostly a patent lawyer who's done a bunch of quantum computing applications. So Mark, why don't you start us off?
Fantastic. Thank you, Lois, and thank you to everyone for joining today. Kanaya and I are very excited to be talking with you. This session is, of course, a follow-up to an article that we wrote several months ago for ABA's SciTech magazine, and so we're glad to be talking with you today about this. Yes, that article right there, exactly. And so, we've prepared two sections to present to you today. So for the first section, I will be giving a quick summary of quantum computing because I realize this is probably a mixed audience. And so I wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about what quantum computing is. And then the second section will be led by Kanaya about the specific legal implications of quantum computing. And so let me go ahead and share my presentation here. And you should all be able to see that, I think, there. So, so just to say a few quick words about the company that we work for, Continuum. Continuum is about a year old, but we have about 20 years of quantum expertise. And the reason for this is because Continuum is the merger between Honeywell Quantum Solutions, which was one of the world's leading quantum hardware providers, and Cambridge Quantum, which was one of the world's leading quantum software providers. And so about a year ago, Honeywell Corporation spun out the quantum division, Cambridge Quantum merged with them. So Continuum we're our own company now, and Kanaya is the legal counsel, and I am the quantum evangelist. And so, so to give you a very quick summary of what quantum computing is, it helps to remember that normal computers use bits, which are just zeros and ones. So everything on a normal computer, including this video presentation, is just a 0 or 1 at the most basic level. But quantum computers use something called a quantum bit, or a qubit, spelled with a QU there. And a qubit can be a 0 and 1 at the same time. And the technical name for this is superposition. And this might sound a little bit odd. How could it be 0 and 1 at the same time? But it sometimes helps to think of it sort of like a coin. So a normal bit is like a coin sitting on a table. It's either heads or tails. There's nothing in between. It's one or the other. But a qubit is a bit like a coin spinning in space. So it's free to rotate, and it could happen to be 0 or 1, or heads or tails in this case, but it's also free to rotate any direction it wants. And so in that case, you might say it's sort of midway between heads and tails. And so when you combine this idea of superposition with another quantum physics concept called entanglement, which is the idea that this qubit over here is correlated with the value of this qubit over here, we unlock a vast number of states, which means these qubits can represent a huge number of possibilities at the same time. And to see why this might be important, on the upper left-hand corner here, this is my favorite molecule, caffeine. and it has 24 atoms, so it's not an especially large molecule. We've known for about 100 years what the equations are for doing a simulation, right? But to solve those equations would take a computer almost the size of the planet. So in principle, we could do it, but it's not very practical. On the lower left-hand corner, this is a larger molecule, penicillin. And again, we know what the equations are, but even in principle, we would not be able to solve this because it would take a computer about the size of the universe. In contrast, a quantum computer could actually solve this very efficiently. It takes only a very modest number of qubits, only a few hundred. And as you'll see, we'll be talking about building quantum computers with thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of qubits. And so that's why we're so excited about quantum computing. It's not just that it's a faster computer, it's that it should be able to solve problems which we never could have hoped to have solved previously. There's not just one way to build a quantum computer. There's actually several different technologies which are being used. So some of these approaches include superconducting, which is an approach that requires some materials be near absolute zero. And this is an approach used by IBM and Google and a few others. There's the approach that we at Quantinuum happen to use, which is the ion trap technology. So we use charged particles called ions, and we control them using lasers. There is an approach using photons or particles of light, and then various other technologies. And there's no obvious winner. We've had a lot of success with our technology. There's also been a lot of developments in the others. It's possible and even likely that several different technologies will all be used in the final end game of quantum computing. There has been extraordinary progress made. Most of you are probably familiar with Moore's law, which has shown over the past several decades that classical computers have doubled in power roughly every 18 months, but quantum is on a much faster trajectory than that. So that turquoise line there, this actually shows the progress made by Quantinuum, and we've actually increased the quantum volume or the power of our quantum computer by a factor of 10 every 12 months. So that's much faster than Moore's law. And based on this trajectory, we think that we will have practical applications in as soon as 3 to 5 years. So that's really no time at all. In fact, the progress has been so quick that we think soon we may not even be able to use quantum volume, because in order to do that, we have to compare it to classical computing. So we think that metric might not even be useful in a few years. In addition to solving problems like chemistry, it will really change every area of science and technology. And this is kind of a roadmap of all the different areas that we think that it will influence. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all of these, but I do want to make a few quick mentions of applications. So there's chemistry, as I mentioned, which is useful for material science and pharmaceuticals. There's industrial applications like planning and scheduling. There's machine learning algorithms, especially as applied to finance. And then there's cryptography. And I'll be talking very quickly about each of these. So in finance, of course, they often want to optimize some sort of parameter subject to other parameters. And normal computers have difficulty doing that because there's often a very large space to consider all the possibilities. But quantum computing often can exponentially speed this up by considering all the possibilities simultaneously. And for example, JP Morgan has invested a lot of resources in this type of work. Another financial application is in algorithms for trading, and this relies largely on Monte Carlo simulations. It turns out that quantum Monte Carlo is quadratically faster than normal Monte Carlo, and so there's a lot of emphasis on that, and we actually have a very large group focusing on this, and we've worked with many financial institutions. There are things like fraud detection that quantum machine learning could be used for, because these are just anomalies wherein you're looking at historical data and looking for cases where you want to leave your legitimate customers alone, of course, but you want to pinpoint where the fraud is happening. You might be familiar with natural language processing from things like Alexa or Siri or chatbots. And of course, there's a whole mathematical structure behind this in which a computer uses to figure out what we mean by these words and how we assemble them into sentences and how the computer can act on that. It turns out that there's a quantum natural language processing. It was actually one of our scientists, Bob Cook, who's now our chief scientist, who realized that the quantum version of this is much more natural. And Kanaya will say much more about that later on. For chemistry, one of the big applications of being able to do molecular simulations would actually be fertilizer. And I know that seems a little bit oddly specific, but fertilizer is about 2% of the world's energy supply. And we are very bad at making fertilizer, but we know that bacteria are much better at it than we are. And it has to do something with this picture here, something with this chemical reaction. We just don't know exactly how it works. And so ideally, we would like to use a quantum computer to understand complicated chemical processes like this. In the pharmaceutical area, of course, they use chemistry. And right now, they use computers to do preliminary work. So they try to make a rough estimate of which drugs might be most promising for medicine. But then they have to do clinical trials. And of course, this takes a long time and it's expensive and it's risky for the people that they're performing the trials on. A quantum computer could make this much more efficient. So we could much more efficiently hone in on the promising medicine. So this would save time and money and make it less risky for those in the trials. We've had several projects doing supply chain scheduling, such as with Nippon Steel. Obviously, it's a very complicated process, the assembly line, the scheduling, and the job shops, and everything like that. And a similar algorithm was used with Deutsche Bahn, in which we took a simplified version of their rail schedule and found a more efficient way to implement this. And then the final thing I want to mention is cryptography. And I've kind of noticed that this is the one thing that people know that quantum computing is related to. So somehow it has something to do with hacking. And there is a reason for this. When we send sensitive information on the internet, what happens is that our computer encrypts it, or it performs a very complicated mathematical formula. And that's what's transmitted. And the receiver on the other end has a key or a string of numbers which are used to undo that formula. And most of the time, this works pretty well because these formulas were purposely chosen to be so complicated that normal computers could not undo them in any reasonable amount of time. It turns out that quantum computers can undo them. And of course, they didn't realize this 60 years ago when they were developing it because no one had even thought of a quantum computer back then. And based on the rate of progress of quantum computing, there actually is a fear that quantum computers could undo many types of encryption in the next few years. So it probably won't happen next week, but it could at some point. And this chart here shows just how significant this would be. The top half of the screen shows all the different algorithms which are vulnerable to quantum computing. And this represents about 99% of encryption online right now. So this is a very serious threat if it happened. Fortunately, people have been paying attention to this. And over the past several years, mathematicians and computer scientists have been developing new types of encryption formulas based on mathematics that we don't think quantum computers can hack. And I want to emphasize the we don't think part because we actually don't know for certain. In fact, there's a government agency called NIST, which is hosting a contest right now. There were over 100 submissions initially, and a few months ago, they announced 4 so-called winners for these what are called post-quantum encryption formulas. And then within days, 2 of them were hacked. So it seems that we still have quite a bit of work to do in understanding how this works. So that brings me to the second part of this presentation, which is based on the article that Kanaya and I wrote on the legal implications of quantum computing, because obviously based on all this new technology, there's going to have to be a lot of new legal framework around all of this. And so with that, I will turn it over to Kanaya.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for attending the presentation. I love to have Mark or really any scientist kind of take a moment and baseline what is quantum computing, because I think there are a lot of myths out there. I've been in this industry just working specifically in quantum for about 6 years as a lawyer. Started out, as Mark mentioned, just the general counsel for Honeywell Quantum Solutions. And I like to say when I was first starting, if people had any context of quantum computing, it was either in the context of what I will call the plot filler for science fiction movies, or they had a general understanding of this scary notion of Shor's algorithm, which I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that you see in the industry today, and so we'll kind of take this and push forward to really what's happening truly over the last couple of years, is you are starting to see significant enough advancements in the technology and in the hardware in particular, that it's causing an inflection point where there's a lot more quantum startups, which is driving investment into the quantum industry with both investors, private investors, public investors. There's public companies now that are quantum companies, and by governments. You are also starting to see large corporations that are investing pretty significant resources in making sure that their workforce and their business is quantum ready. And you're also starting to see governments begin to be concerned about not just the impact of quantum computing, but also about the ability of other nation states to advance their hardware technology. And so all of these things are kind of leading to what I like to say, a number of larger issues in the legal community. First are the near-term legal issues facing the quantum industry. And then second are the legal issues that are created by quantum computing. And so I wanted to start with IP, because typically when I do talk to other lawyers in the business, or certainly other quantum industries, the real question is, what about IP? And so, I always like to baseline that, again, this field is very nascent. As Mark said, there's a number of different hardware systems, and each of these systems need to scale. So, you have superconducting qubits, you have trapped ion quantum computers, you have neutral atoms, you have quantum annealing, you have photonics, and each of these systems look different. An example that I like to give, if you look at our trapped ion quantum computer, it takes up about 1,100 square feet. It sits on two rather large optical tables. You have a bunch of lasers and optics that essentially groom laser beams that go into a vacuum chamber and essentially shine light on our atoms, which we ionize, and then we perform operations on those ions. All of the system component parts that need to go into that are very different than what you would see if you Google, say, IBM system, which you would probably see a very pretty gold chandelier looking thing called a dilution refrigeration system, which is kind of the backbone for how they perform their superconducting quantum computers. So the reason I raise that is because the physical hardware associated with these devices are very, very new. And so, and very different. And in order to move beyond the field that, as I mentioned, we're very nascent, very, just kind of in the, what we call the NISQ era, which is the noisy intermediate scale quantum era, which means these devices, they can run toy problems. They are about as strong as your laptop today, maybe, a GPU cluster. But they are very quickly advancing beyond that. But as they advance, the subcomponent parts and the way these systems look are changing. And so what does that mean for IP? It means that a lot of the patent applications that are being filed today, especially associated with the hardware devices and the architecture, may or may not be used in the systems of tomorrow, the systems in a few years, because the scaling, there's a number of different engineering and physical problems that have to be solved. So a lot of these patents that are moving forward in some ways to help enhance the portfolio for investment and investors. So that's one of the issues that's facing the industry. The other two areas where you start to see a lot of patents coming up are on the operation systems, the codes associated with running the quantum computers, and then patent applications related to software applications and quantum algorithms. And in those three areas, especially the last two, as I'm sure many of our patent lawyers who may be on the call can think through, there's a lot of issues with securing patents associated with software. I won't get into all of those issues in this discussion, but a lot of these issues are facing the community. The other piece that I would note is that understanding the physics behind these systems can be a bit of a challenge for your patent prosecution teams that are looking to either draft claims or prosecute the claims before your various patent granting bodies like the PTO. So could you go to the next slide, Mark? Oh, I'm sorry, no, we can stay on that slide. So the other piece I wanted to talk about with an IP is really around the concept of patent pooling. Now, as I mentioned, all of these hardware devices are very nascent. They're changing the software applications, notwithstanding any of the legal issues with securing patents in software applications or quantum algorithms, they are not necessarily, we don't know whether they will become a universal application, something that will be used on multiple systems or used for multiple years. And so the concept of patent pooling really becomes a challenge. So before I go on that, I should pause for a moment and just give a little bit of a baseline for those who may not be familiar with the term patent pools. Patent pools are essentially an agreement between two or more patent holders to license their patents to one another or to third parties. And really the purpose behind it is to facilitate sharing and transfer of IP and really push innovation without so much disturbance around some of the IP legal issues that companies may be facing. And it's a really good strategy in certain industries where there's multiple entities holding multiple patents that overlap with one another or have interconnected claims. And, an example would be like the wireless industry, where there's just multiple patents in this area. That's not where this industry is today. Again, you can kind of guess between the hardware devices, a lot of these near-term applications that may be specific to one problem, but are not universal applications. There's no industry-wide accepted standards. As Mark mentioned earlier, we've been using the standard of quantum volume, which was actually created by IBM, but that is going to lose its efficacy as these systems gain strength. And so the nascency really makes it challenging to understand and to look at how and where you as a business leader want to secure your patents. So the other area where I wanted to spend a little bit of time, you can go to the next slide now, Mark, is around quantum natural language processing. So natural language processing generally, which is a subset of AI, processes natural human language via voice or text. And so most people are familiar with things like Siri or Alexa, asking what the weather is, and you probably will get a fairly good response, but sometimes I'm sure we've all experienced those times where it might not be 100% accurate. So natural language processing is really a promising industry. It's one that we're seeing a lot of advancements, and I'm putting aside quantum for a minute, just truly natural language processing. It's got an expected total addressable market of about 26 billion over the next 5 or so years. But it has several important implications for the legal field. And the first that I want to talk through is actually access to the justice, closing the justice gap. So for folks who may or may not be familiar, there's been over the years, there's escalating costs and increasing complexity of both the law itself and the institutions that apply and enforce it. And that means that really justice in its purest form is becoming more and more out of reach for ordinary people. This is compounded particularly in the United States, but really around the world, with growing immigration challenges where people may or may not be speaking the native language. And so in courts, you often find language barriers or context barriers. And the current software that exists today is really kind of limited in how much it can accomplish in these areas. As we start to build out this technology, it really does pose an opportunity for the legal field to help support providing legal services to a variety of people. And by replacing, by not just providing the legal services themselves, which I'll talk about in a minute as it relates to contract review and processing a lot of the documents and data that come along with litigation, things like that. But it also can, and I realize this is a little controversial for most lawyers, but it can actually replace the role of legal and court experts. That's not to say that AI or natural language processing or quantum language natural processing will ever replace lawyers. They will not, but it will help reduce some of the barriers that really exist today. So and I think a lot of folks have seen this even in the context of COVID and seeing how courts were really forced to move to remote legal services and reliance upon more software tools and technology, intelligence tools to be able to help manage the caseloads that were coming. So what about quantum natural language processing and why is it different? So I don't want to dig too much. I would probably have to turn back to Mark to dig into the concept of computational mathematics, which is what he mentioned Dr. Koch, Bob Koch, who works for us, is doing and focused on. But why it's different is that it really allows for techniques that are more intuitive for the way we recognize both speech and grammar. And that becomes important because the compositional way of establishing this grammatical structure in the quantum model can help construe vocabulary and grammar and add that context and meaning that is somewhat of a challenge today in your traditional traditional software. The other thing that I would note in this is that quantum computers themselves are going to be enablers for AI and traditional natural language processing. Before I move on to that, Mark, is there anything you would want to add just from a technical perspective associated with how we're functioning on quantum? Okay, thank you. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And then I wanted to spend a little bit of time on cybersecurity, because as Mark mentioned, and as I mentioned, this is probably the field where most people, if they have heard of quantum computing, think about what quantum computing does. And this is where quantum computers will be very impactful to the legal field and really probably are today. So why is that? So let's start with the concept of that a lot of governments and companies are facing, and it's the concept of hack now and decrypt later. So over the years, bad actors are scooping up data, they're hacking into systems, and they're grabbing encrypted data. Whether or not that data can be decrypted today is really not important to them, as it is that it can be decrypted at some point. And the way that many people think this will happen sits with something called Shor's algorithm. Of course, there's other methodologies that may be used, but Shor's algorithm is probably the best known way in which the community believes public key encryption will be hacked, if you will. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on how that works, but fundamentally, when these systems are strong enough to run Shor's algorithm, they will allow exponential factoring so that you can do brute force attacks and essentially break open things like banking transfers or national security secrets, things that really, really scare a bunch of people. And so why is that important? And before I go on, let me just say that is not happening. The hack now, decrypt later, scooping of data is happening, but the ability to decrypt public key encryption, that is not capable today. That's not happening today. But the concern is growing. And so you're starting to see more and more regulations, executive orders, statements by Congress, acts by Congress that are requiring both the government and the defense industrial base to strengthen their cybersecurity architecture. So what does that mean? And Mark touched on this a lot, in that, NIST has just now released kind of their what they consider to be post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, and those are important. But what does that mean practically for your clients, for your customers, for your companies? It means that you have to go back through, review the entire cybersecurity architecture that exists for your company, and figure out where the vulnerabilities are and how to protect them. That is a huge undertaking. And I think that's one thing that even now today, people are just starting to realize just how much of an undertaking it is. In many cases, you have, particularly for large companies, you have it's a defense in depth strategy, but you have a cybersecurity architecture that is almost built on top of each other. And so you have situations where, as you dig down deep into the architecture and the framework that exists in your company, you're finding more and more vulnerabilities, things that haven't been updated, things that need to be changed. And so the amount of time it takes to survey your cybersecurity architecture and then be able to deploy the proper algorithms and tools that are necessary to quantum harden your system is going to take years. And so that's why you're seeing more and more companies focus on this today. From a legal perspective, you're also starting to see many more contracts that have really strong requirements around cyber breaches, around reportability, around liability, almost every company out there now has, their cybersecurity insurance. So a lot of these issues are stemming from this quantum threat. Again, I want to put out there that this threat is going to take a long time because the systems are not strong enough today. But companies and governments are preparing today because the threat is out there and it will be coming. The one other area I wanted to touch on that actually has really, really heated up more, and I don't have a slide on it, so forgive me, is around export controls. So as I mentioned, you're starting to see significant advancements in the ecosystem, and you're seeing the growing threat of Shor's algorithm, cybersecurity hackers, et cetera. And so governments around the world are extremely concerned about their adversaries' ability to continue to develop the technology. And so typically in an export control world, you would have one or more countries go within the Wassenaar framework, which for those who don't know, it's something like 42 countries that make up a governing body of similar standards for certain technologies that are, say, night vision goggles, meaning that if the United States wants to ship night vision goggles to the UK, if they need a license, things are going to look similar around these countries or between these countries. One of those countries is Russia. And so what's happened is, given the recent invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, the ability to make progress in Wassenaar is virtually non-existent. And so now what's happening, and we see this as a company that operates in multiple jurisdictions around the world, we are seeing each jurisdiction thinking about unilateral controls. This starts to be concerning because, as I mentioned earlier, as these systems are scaling, the supply chain is growing, and a lot of the supplies are not domestic. They're certainly not to the United States. We often say for our system, the ion trapping system, we get somewhere between 70 to 80% of our subcomponent parts from other countries. So having unilateral controls can have a significant impact on the supply chain for being able to actually get the supplies that are needed and understand whether or not you can continue to work with the supplier to build out and scale the particular subcomponent part that you need to be able to operate the system in a manner that's going to be conducive for commercialization. So with that, I'm not sure, Lois, if we've received any questions so far, but we wanted to spend some time allowing people the opportunity to ask questions, just given the fact that, it is a bit of a complex area. And feel free to ask any type of questions. We wanted to provide kind of a survey of these legal issues. They're growing, they are becoming more and more complex, and, they're shifting just based on the ecosystem.
We don't actually have any questions yet, but please ask them in the chat and I will queue them up.
Fantastic. Well, I guess while we're waiting, there's one other area that I will also talk about. And it was, it again is probably more US focused, but it is around CFIUS. So again, quantum computing is a very, very, the US government, governments around the world, but particularly the US government is very focused on protecting quantum computing, the technology that's domestic within the United States, and certainly protecting adversaries, or protecting the technology from adversaries. And so one of the tools that they've been using is CFIUS. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of startups coming in the field. And so any type of, so for folks who don't know, the CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment within the United States. And there are certain key technologies and other areas where, as foreign entities look to invest in US critical companies, a certain amount, whether they want, say, board seats or they want to own a significant portion of these companies, the United States, through a series of, I believe, 7 different departments and agencies across the United States, like Department of Defense, Treasury, Commerce, State, Justice, others, Department of Energy, they review the transaction and look for any type of national security concerns. So recently, quantum computing was identified as one of those technologies that there is significant scrutiny. And so that again imposes longer wait times for new startup companies who are doing who are looking to take on investments and really drive the drive themselves through the ecosystem. So, traditionally an investment round that may have taken a few months may take upwards of 6 to 8 months now, because they're going through this process of review. I think I saw a couple of questions come in.
Yes. Okay. Let's start with a really broad one. John Gaither is asking, in what areas are our current legal frameworks inadequate to deal with issues involving quantum computing?
That's a great question. And honestly, I actually, the first thing that pops in my head really is probably around export control. And the reason I raise that framework, and by the way, this isn't solely unique to quantum computing, but it is, I'll explain why it's a little bit different than, say, some of the semiconductor issues and other areas of key technologies. And it kind of has to do with the nascency. And so let me give you an example. As I mentioned, our system has about 70 to 80% of our subcomponent parts coming from offshore. Most of these systems, up until maybe 5 years ago, were found in academic labs and R&D spaces. They were not necessarily made readily available to the commercial industry. And so what that means is there's two things happening. The systems they're very bespoke, and they are cobbled together from various COTS, so commercial off-the-shelf type items, that are then modified in-house and used in the system. The suppliers of these COTS items may sell, say, 100 widgets a year to the quantum computing industry, but they also will sell 1 million widgets to an adjacent industry. And in that adjacent industry, there are no controls. And we've actually had several suppliers say that they would walk away from selling to quantum systems or quantum computing companies if their product then becomes controlled. That's a huge concern for a cottage industry that does not have the ability to drive revenue to supplement, right, the cost that the suppliers would have to take on. So that's one issue. The second issue is around what comes in with deemed export, and that is needing to bring these systems up to a scale that'll be compatible with commercialization. So for example, the lasers that we use, again, were typically used in an R&D setting. They may have, say, a 2,000 hour life. We need 10,000 hours. And so being able to work with these suppliers to move these supply parts out of kind of the bespoke, mom and dad shops, putting them together and into more of a commercialized setting is really critical. And again, it takes a lot of work to make this happen, and imposing your more traditional manners of export control are going to be really impactful to almost curtailing the ability for the industry to grow and scale. And as I mentioned, it becomes even more important with unilateral controls. So I think that's probably the first framework. I think the second piece, I think the IP framework generally is probably going to be okay. It's more a question of whether or not the patents that are being secured today are going to be meaningful in 5 to 10 years time, and how a company can think about, securing their potential today for licensing tomorrow. I see a lot more questions coming in.
Yes. Next one. Adebayeho asked, and I apologize if I probably mangled your name. For top tips would you give general lawyers about this topic other than cybersecurity issues for their firms? How should they alert their clients about what's coming along?
Great question. So like I said, the three areas where you're seeing the most traction is around IP. So lots of patents are being secured right now. So paying attention to the patent landscape, if they are a quantum or quantum adjacent company, doing white space analyses, ensuring that they understand, what jurisdictions and what regions certain companies are practicing in, staying abreast of that is important. Staying abreast of particularly suppliers. If the company you're representing is involved in the supply chain, staying really, really tied into understanding that supply chain, understanding the vulnerabilities, and in particular, paying attention to how much of that supply is coming out of China or Russia. As many people may know, the US government and many other governments have imposed sanctions, restrictions, export controls, et cetera, on a ton of technology and money and other resources going into Russia. There are more and more signals that not just the US government, but certainly other, we'll say, friendly governments to the United States that sit within the various frameworks of the UN or others are signaling that they have great concerns for China. This is in some ways, probably the biggest concern for suppliers because raw materials and other technologies, software applications, things like that, almost everything today is touching China. And so as those restrictions and impositions, come into place, it's going to be more of a concern. So one of the things, if I were sitting in private practice and talking to companies, I would be encouraging them to really think about doing some type of heat map or analysis of where their potential risks sit in the supply chain and then how you pull them in.
Thanks. This one is sort of a combination of questions. Laura is asking about do either Mark or Kanaya have a sense of industry predictions of the timeline for when we arrive at when we can actually decrypt the data that's being collected? And in a similar vein, Brad E was asking, how governments collecting data feel about, storing data now and decrypting it later.
Let me take the first one. But Mark, do you want to take the first one? Because I think
I was going to say, yeah, I can comment. So the truth is we don't know. As Kanai mentioned, we're not doing this today. There's no decryption that we know of that's happening today because of quantum. It could happen in a few years, but the truth is we don't know. The reason for all the uncertainty is because, so first there's the hardware progress. As I said, we're making extraordinary progress. In a few years, it might be possible. But then on the software side, so Shore, who is a professor at MIT, he developed this method about 25 years ago. So he showed that there was a recipe for doing this decryption. It doesn't mean that it's the only recipe for doing this, and it doesn't even mean it's the most efficient way. He just showed it exists, right? There is a way to do it. And we've already made a lot of progress on the software, the algorithmic side of it. So it could be that in a year, some very smart young person finds some shortcut that's able to do it much sooner than we all imagined. So that's why it is not too soon to be upgrading security and thinking about all the things that Kai mentioned. So the truth is we don't know. It's not happening today, but in a few years it could happen.
Yeah, I that's exactly what I was going to say. It's, I would say, I was actually talking to one of our scientists yesterday, and she was mentioning that, the advancements that the systems are making around error suppression and error correction, which is one of the ways in which you basically reduce the noise in these systems and are able to get higher fidelities in your answer. It's surprising the foremost leading experts in the world on how these systems are advancing. So it's really, really too challenging to tell. To the question around how governments feel about the storage of collect now, decrypt later, I would say many people, at least in the US government, would say that there has been a cyber war for years, maybe at least a decade. between the United States and its adversaries. I'm reticent to mention all of the adversaries that the US may or may not feel they have. But certainly there are nation states that are doing everything they can to both leapfrog their way to attempt to global technological supremacy, and to gain as much information and data as possible. So if you think about, since I had mentioned earlier, banking information, I think everybody would be worried about nuclear codes, nuclear information, building weapons, things like that, right? All of that data is highly, highly protected. And so to the extent that there is a fear that that could be decrypted, I don't think from a government perspective, governments would necessarily be worried about the cost or the storage, but rather the ability to, find a way, because I think there's, information is power, and being able to gather and obtain this data is important. The other piece I would mention is it's not just governments and nation states that are focused on this. A lot of the data scoopage is from bad actors. Organized crime is actually doing some of this. There's bad actors around the globe that would love to have your bank account numbers, or JP Morgan, or any banking institutions numbers, and be able to get into these accounts. So I think it's really, I would suggest that it's not some like general scoop of everything happening, as it is the fear of the specific really high value targeted data that is getting scooped or potentially trying to be scooped. So I think that's where there's a little bit of maybe a nuance, but I'm not entirely sure I answered the question. So feel free to clarify if I didn't.
Staying on the encryption topic for another round. John Gaither's asking about the flip side of quantum decryption, which is quantum encrypted communications and its implications.
I can say a few words about this. So John is right. Even though hacking using quantum gets a lot of attention, what's lesser known is that quantum technologies can be used to protect communication. And the way that this is done is that you exchange qubits effectively. You usually use photons, so again, the particles of light, because that can communicate the quantum data itself. And this is usually done over fiber optics or even lasers over empty space. And this exists, fiber optic networks exist. In New York City here, we're already wired with Verizon with fiber optics and stuff. So this type of infrastructure does exist. But what will need to happen is that governments and banks and such, they'll need to extend this much broader, and then they can use this to do something called quantum key distribution. So they can use this quantum internet, if you will, to exchange the sort of the passwords used for the encryption and decryption. We know, for example, that China has already launched a quantum satellite called Messius, in which they were able to do video conferencing using this quantum data. So yes, this type of technology does exist, and it's essentially unhackable, because you're not just encrypting using complicated formulas, you're using the basic laws of physics to do this.
Thanks. And Paul Arnn is asking about other efforts to decrypt using quantum, other than factoring primes, such as elliptical curves. We may be getting a little bit into the weeds here for our more non-technical folks.
Most of the attention I know has been on factoring primes. So that's the basis for RSA encryption, for example. Yeah, I think there's a few others, but that's the one. It's exponentially faster than classical decryption.
Mhm.
Yes. I had a paper on this that I was looking. I would not be the right person to explain it, but I do believe there are several papers on arXiv that talk through elliptical curves. Yeah, I know it is more popular related to blockchain. I would have to go and look on on archive to make sure that I was properly citing, but I believe there is a paper associated with like doing an analysis on binary elliptical curves. So I would encourage you to look on archive. For the folks who don't know, archive is a repository run by, I can't remember, one of the institutions, academic institutions, that allows for physicists and other scientists, but to post their work. I guess, Mark, it's kind of like sort of like a peer review opportunity where you can get out your information.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it's Cornell that runs it. So you can upload a copy of your article before you send it to a journal for publication. So this means that anyone in the world can immediately access it.
Switching gears, Hugh Wellens is asking, how will this alter the practice of law? For instance, developing more sophisticated forms to fill out after analyzing the results of an interview process, and other document management sorts of things, or other things.
Yeah.
Other things.
That's a great question. And I actually kind of skipped over that a little bit, so apologies. I actually think that's probably the biggest, most near-term use is really managing data and doing, between contract review and analysis, helping to pull things into plain language, or to understand, certain phraseology where there's ambiguity or vagueness. So I think that's one enabler. I think the other area is just managing, some of these really, really complex litigations where you have millions upon millions of documents. I actually started my career doing complex class action litigation, and the amount of money and time that is spent on just processing documents is astronomical. And so being able to utilize technologies that help reduce both the time, the review, and the spend is going to be really critical. I think that's probably where the most near-term use cases would be for the legal industry.
Do you have a sense of when that's going to be commercialized enough for use?
I know that there are certainly document management services that are using this type of technology today. It is good. It is not great. And I think I'm sure it's certainly good. I think, being able to reach the point where you can harness the context behind language, right? So when you're developing AI and you're kind of teaching through the software programming, these systems to recognize things, it takes a long time and it's a bit hit or miss, and there's a lot of advancement that needs to be made. If I had to guess, and I don't know, I'd kind of look at Mark as well, but maybe 5-7 years, you're going to start to see, I'd say, more advancement.
That's usually the time frame given. 3 to 5 is maybe a little optimistic, but 5 to 7 is a little more conservative. Yeah, but that's the time scale where we will start to see practical implications of this.
Yeah. And then I guess the other thing I would note is, perhaps not for the sci-tech division of ABA, but sometimes lawyers are considered to be a little bit less focused on taking on, technology to be able to help them in their practice. So that might also add a couple years to the impact of the industry. But certainly nobody on this call or in the sci-tech division, of course. We all love technology.
Well, plus once clients start using anything, we have to know about it anyway.
Exactly.
Robert Joint was asking, are panelists aware of any active litigation involving quantum? And if so, what issues? And if not, when do you think we might start seeing something, and what kind of thing?
Good question. So I'm not aware of a lot. I know that there's, your typical trademark disputes and here and there some challenges to patent applications. I think where you're starting to also see some litigation crop up is around investment and shareholders. And so this summer there was a report issued by Scorpion Capital that was it's a very unfortunate report about a different quantum computing company that's really resulting in The report was very inflammatory. And, you know, so that's one of them that I'm familiar with. I guess I would say this. I think part of the challenge is there is a lot of general hype in the industry. As I mentioned, there's a lot of investment, and with investment, you have to be at least optimistic, right, with what these systems are. There's also a lack of understanding, I think, from a business perspective or a financial perspective of just what the time scale looks like and what the actual challenges are for reaching, you know, a time where these systems really are advantageous and bringing in near-term value creation. So I think that if you start to look at the very near term, it'll likely be in more shareholder or investor type of litigation. But always, I think in any context, you're going to have patent challenges, especially as people become more sophisticated in understanding the technology.
Thanks. I'll add one. Probably this is from Mark. Do you have any sense of when the molecular analysis and some of the optimization problem solving might hit actual commercial use?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's actually funny that you asked that. Just a few months ago, we at Quantinuum unveiled the world's first commercial quantum chemistry application, based on many projects we've done over 5 years. And so you need to be a chemist to use it, but you don't need to be a quantum computing expert to use it. As we said, right now, a quantum computer can't do anything that a normal computer can't. But I'm guessing 3 to 5 years, we will start to see applications in chemistry. I don't think they'll be life-changing, but I think they'll be kind of interesting. But I think within about 8 years, we will start to see really amazing things.
Thanks. And I think this might be the last question, but Anne-Marie Weiss is asking if you have any book or other source recommendations.
Kanaya has volunteered to write a book. Well, I would be remiss not to say, when I first started, I think I started with the Quantum Computer Book for Babies. I like to show my advancement moving from quantum computing for babies, which actually is a rather good starting board book, but all the way through, like, you know, college physics. I think understanding enough of the technology is important. From a legal perspective, I am not as familiar with certain books. I do know some of our scientists actually have written some books. If you go on the Quantinuum website, you can have links to them. But you will find more resources in understanding the technology than I think from a legal perspective. But perhaps someone on the call would like to help me with said book. By the way, I have not.
I know of 1 or 2 books that have been written, which are pretty good about quantum computing. One is by Robert Laredo of IBM, and the other is by Bob Souter, now at Cold Quanta. And so those are kind of introduction to quantum computing. They're a little bit technical. There's also several blogs, like the Quantum Computing Report is more business focused. The Quantum Daily, for example, like that. As Kanaya mentioned, I don't know of any quantum law books because the field is developing so rapidly. There'd be no point in writing a book right now.
Thanks. There are also, if you're interested in, the architecture and seeing what individual quantum circuits can do, there are also some simulators out on the web that teach you about individual quantum gates and how they manipulate qubits and what happens if you do this or that. That's fairly in the weeds for this audience, but if you like playing around with computers, might be interesting as well. So I believe we're at the top of the hour. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? Laura has something to add. Laura, please go ahead.
I just wanted to thank everyone for your presentation today. It was fantastic, and I was giving my applause. So thank you. It was terrific.
Thanks. And Laura Pozeski is our chair-elect, so she will be chair of the section next year. Thank you, everyone. And we're glad to have you aboard. And if you're also if you're other resources are the section's website, the section's magazine, the SciTech Lawyer, which did an issue on quantum computing back in the spring, of which these folks were a part. I believe Lionel has given you the link, and we'll wrap things up. Thanks, everyone.